Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to join this panel tonight and to have an opportunity to have a discussion with you all about one of the most important issues that we face, not only from a global climate point of view, but from a global biodiversity point of view and a global poverty point of view. Before I get into a few slides on some of the issues around forests, let me just say that having worked in environment internationally as a development issue for a long time, the forests as a key focal area have gone up and down. The forests were a major focus in the early 90s, and there was considerable funding went into the forest sector and into rural development related to forest protection, into community forests and so on. But what we've seen over the last 15 or so years has been a gradual decline in funding for addressing forest-related issues until recently, when the penny dropped and all of a sudden there was a recognition of how important forests are for climate. And so all of a sudden there's a lot of new money and a lot of new focus on forests, but mainly coming from the climate angle. And so what I'd like to talk about tonight is really how important it is that, yes, forests are important for climate, but we need to keep the big picture. We need to look at the multiple benefits of forests. And we also need to recognize that in times past, often focus on forests from a development point of view has ended up hurting, not helping forest communities in some places. And so we need to have a very strong focus on retaining the attention to the need of local communities as we move forward. If we look at forests as a land use continuum, first off, we need to recognize there's a huge number of very poor communities that rely totally on forests, including a very large number of indigenous communities and others that live within the forest masses that we have. But overall, about almost 2 billion people rely on forests for their livelihoods, for their shelter, in some form or another. So forests are clearly a key part of any kind of a development agenda in terms of looking at poverty reduction and at economic growth opportunities for countries. Forests hold very valuable assets for countries. The new part of the story, which is really stimulating, as I mentioned, stimulating the discussion now, is the recognition that forests, about 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we have projected right now are from deforestation and forest degradation. And so how do we deal with that? The other even more recent recognition is how important forests are to adaptation, to climate resilience of different communities, particularly poor communities in developing countries. So if we're going to deal with forests in a sustainable fashion, if we're really going to achieve reducing deforestation, whether it's for climate purposes or others, we've got to understand what the underlying causes are. And often those underlying causes are not in the forests themselves. A large extent is just simply rural poverty, but there are a lot of much of the deforestation that we see and degradation we see today is due to decisions of governments on agriculture policy, on mining policy, a number of policy decisions that are not within the forest sector itself. We also still have a great deal of unsustainable logging going on. And when it comes to the ability for developing countries to actually manage the efforts that they have to reduce deforestation rates and improve forest management, there's a tremendous gap in terms of institutional capacity and financial resources for the institutions responsible. Governance and corruption is a major issue in the forest sector, and one of the reasons that forestry is such a difficult area to work in. Forests are extremely undervalued. The ecosystem services of forests are generally not recognized, whether it's water, whether it's soil fertility, whether it's the livelihoods for the rural poor, and so on. These are not valued. The lack of land tenure and rights is a major issue in the forest sector, and lack of capital is finally another major issue. And unless these drivers of deforestation are addressed, then all of the technical work that's going on right now to include forestry as a part of a climate change solution agenda are not going to succeed, in my opinion, because governments can make decisions about reducing deforestation rates to generate carbon credits, but governments are not, the central governments are not where the solutions have to be driven. They are in the field, they're either addressing rural poverty, governance, and so on. If we look at this in terms of the major sources of deforestation, the big ticket items are small-scale agriculture and shifting cultivation, so very much a rural poverty issue. Commercial-scale agriculture crops is the second, and third is commercial-scale logging, both legal and illegal. Cattle ranching is a growing cause of deforestation. Forests are key for addressing the needs of the rural poor. That we've known that for a long time. They're now key to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the question is, how do we go about dealing with this? If we're going to really understand how to solve the forest problem, we've got to recognize that there's also a great opportunity to help countries and communities adapt to climate change by improving forest management and the health of forests. Typically you will see pictures like this, which are tropical lowland and highland forests. You rarely see pictures of mangroves, but actually mangrove forests are often left out of the debate, and we've lost 20% of the mangroves over the last about 20 to 30 years. A tremendous asset for countries in terms of ecosystem services, aquatic productivity, community development opportunities, and increasingly an important source of climate resilience to storm surges from climate change. So in Myanmar, it was very clear from the last storm in Myanmar, those areas that still have healthy mangroves were much less hit. They were hit less than those areas where the mangroves had been degraded, typically for shrimp ponds and other purposes. So the importance of forests for climate resilience are also very important. Very quickly, just to note that in order to save time, I'm going to breeze through some of these. The key point here is that we're hearing a lot about how important forests are for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's absolutely key. But we also need to recognize that climate change itself is going to have dramatic impacts on some of the world's key forests across the Amazon, in the Congo, and so on. 40 to 50 years from now, based on some new modeling work that's done, those forests are going to start degrading as a result of climate change. So we've got a real challenge in front of us. In the near term, we need to make sure that we reduce deforestation rates and improve the health of those ecosystems to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we don't do that, then the forests are going to degrade even faster because of the increase in the greenhouse gas concentrations. But again, to be able to deal with these issues, we need to focus less on the forests and more on the issues that drive deforestation, governance, rights, tenure, access, and so on. The other point I would like to make is that doesn't come out in the discussions, which tend to focus on REDD, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, which is very, very important. This is the focus of the global climate negotiations today. But it should also be recognized that there's tremendous potential for sequestering and improving the climate situation by focusing on sustainable forest management, reforestation, afforestation, improved forest management in areas. So it's not just about reducing deforestation, it's also about improving the quality of degraded forests and putting forests in place on degraded lands where they used to be and lands are now unproductive. Just to give an idea of how this all fits together, you've got a number of countries that actually don't have high deforestation rates. And much of the debate today in the international negotiations is about, well, do those countries benefit from a new climate agreement in terms of carbon revenues? This is a major issue because those countries have been good stewards of the forest, but they're likely not to benefit, based on the current negotiations, not likely to benefit from payments for reducing deforestation rates because they have low deforestation rates. Our view, quite frankly, is that those countries have very major threats to their forests. They haven't been deforested yet, but the threats are there. And so it's going to be important that any kind of an international agreement recognizes the need to deal with all of the different countries, the so-called red countries that have relatively high and increasing deforestation rates today, but also those countries that don't have high deforestation rates yet. And then also we need to look at the opportunities in low forest cover countries to actually increase forest cover. And there are some huge potentials in a number of countries for doing that. Then, as I mentioned earlier, forests have a major role in actually adapting to climate change. This is not well recognized, and it hasn't come up as a major part of the climate negotiations. But we believe this is, if we focus on both the mitigation and the adaptation side, that we can really look at how forests contribute to addressing the climate change challenges that we have, but also improving the social well-being and financial well-being of rural communities, and particularly generating the maximum ecosystem services from those forests. So it's not just about mitigation, it's not just about adaptation, it's about the comprehensive valuation of the forests and the management of those forests to generate the maximum benefits. So it's about avoiding the unmanageable, which is mitigation, the impacts of climate change, and manage the unavoidable, which are the impacts of climate change that we're already feeling today. I'm gonna stop at this point, I think, because Simon's gonna talk about indigenous peoples, and so I'm not sure how you can cut this off, but I'll stop at this point now.